Hello again. This is James from Canonical, and today we are continuing our discussion of Mo Yan's The Garlic Ballads.
We have been talking a lot about censorship here, and I think that normally when people use this phrase, poisoning the well, they're talking about kind of a rhetorical fallacy, saying that nothing can be good because it comes from a bad place. But when we talk about Chinese censorship, has China really poisoned the well? I think in the article by Thomas Chen that we have been discussing, he claims that foreign readers are consistently doubtful of the accuracy or sincerity of writing coming out of China when that kind of doubt is unjustified. But if that doubt happens, whose fault is it?
I think this is a tricky question because I think we have real examples of China being directly at fault. But Chen gives us a pretty convincing argument that maybe China is not always to blame, especially currently. Maybe China's not on the censorship button as much as they used to be. So maybe the fault isn't always with them. Maybe the fault is something foreign born. Like maybe this is coming from Goldblatt or American publishers.
When you create a situation where people frequently cannot say what they would like to say, and when people say what they would like to say and then it's very quickly erased, when that type of climate is the norm, will doubt ever be anything other than pervasive?
I think my response to this and also to your previous question is actually very similar, which is it is very hard for Americans to visualize that because we don't live in the same political climate that someone like a Chinese person who has to endure this kind of censorship lives under. And because of that, we have a preconception of what it's like to live in that world. And I say this as like, all three of us have lived in China, and all three of us have interacted with people in China. I think that there is perhaps not now so much as before, but definitely during the Cultural Revolution, there's this idea that you have to be careful what you say because saying the wrong thing could get you imprisoned or killed. Like, we don't know what it's like to live in that kind of atmosphere. We can only hazard a guess. And because we don't know, I think when we read someone who comes from that kind of background or setting, we maybe will read it with some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration of their plight. Yeah, and so to the second question about why would we not always be doubtful, or perhaps why we would be doubtful, I feel like people would because they, especially if you take it to extreme, like during the Cultural Revolution, when the consequences of saying the wrong thing is death, I think people would have this kind of mistrust of what's being said, of society in general. But once again, I think I'm kind of projecting because I didn't grow up in that situation.
I think that a writer like Chen would like to reorient the West's view of China and have us have a perhaps more sympathetic view of China. But I just don't know if it's really possible at this point because of the way people already understand China and its government. But also, I think there is a distinction, and I'm not quite sure what it is, between the way that Chinese government agents censor their population and the way foreign governments censor their population, because it's not a specifically Chinese problem. But this doubt is much more prevalent in China than anywhere else. So, what is the distinction between censorship in that country and censorship in our countries?
Maybe the overtness, which, when you think about it, is kind of scary. James, I remember we have talked about whether total freedom of speech is something that is actually desirable. That's something that comes up a lot these days. For sure, there are things that get censored that we probably don't know about or don't think about that are less overt than the kinds of censorship we're talking about here with China. And maybe that is more insidious than something more overt, something more instantly noticeable.
So I said earlier how we don't live under the same political climate, and obviously I still think so, it being just a few minutes later. But I do think that it is interesting to consider whether or not the media in the US is analogous in some way, because when you look at echo chambers that are present with, I mean, Fox News is old news now. Now it's what, like,
Newsmax
was it?
and
Yeah,
OAN.
Newsmax, which is like Fox News taken to the extreme. I mean, people who are not in the bubble, they automatically discount anything that happens on Newsmax, right? So I don't know if that's similar in that way, because it's not censorship per se, even though they give you a filtered version of events.
Right. It's not like you can't go outside of that and find out other perspectives.
You can say it's the same in the sense that because they use such an obvious filter, you could say then that you can only blame them when people who are not regular viewers will always doubt everything they have to say. Because they have established a reputation for being liars, of course they should expect that everyone will regard them as liars.
Yeah, that's the analogy that I would make. But it's not similar in other ways, right? It's not similar in other ways because it's not the state doing it. I think that's a pretty important distinction.
Does it matter though? Like, is the corporate censorship or quote unquote censorship that we have in the US really different from state censorship in China? Would it be fair for readers outside of the US to constantly doubt everything that we have to say because we're Americans?
I think the difference is the access to multiple points of view. And even though being in an echo chamber limits your ability to trust other points of view, it's still available. So if you are in the Newsmax echo chamber, it is still possible for you to get news from CNN. But if you're in China, you can get news from China Daily, or you can get it from what is it? What's the something Times? Oh, right, Global Times, which I think is even more nationalistic, right, than China Daily. Like, the news is either very censored or even more censored. So you would not really have the access. I think that's quite different. The question really is, and this is kind of getting far afield, when you're in the echo chamber, is it actually possible for you to really consider alternative news sources and alternative facts? If you're so deep into the Newsmax bubble, can you actually see CNN and internalize it as truth? Because if you can't, then no, it's not different from being in a state with heavy censorship.